to this, another episode of A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is where we break down and discuss episodes of TV shows that you may not have even heard of. I believe these TV shows need a little more love, and that is what this platform is here to do. Each week we will be covering different shows from all over the globe. We'll be breaking down each episode, giving you the main highlights, and going through it bit by bit. But for now, I think it's best that we find out what's on the menu today. Hello there, and welcome back to this A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is now episode 3 of season 7, and as all of you know by now, hopefully you'll have got used to the way this podcast works, so you'll know that we'll be going back to Hannibal season 3 in this episode. Now, as I've said on multiple occasions, I love this show so much, and I'm gutted to see that it's going. In fact, I've took a little break from recording because, in all fairness, it sucks knowing that this is coming to an end. It's a little bit like A Million Little Things, where I knew it was so good and I just didn't want it to end. So I've ended up taking a little bit of a break. I'm coming back now, and it is mid-November, and I am trying to get this episode out before I go on holiday. Or I'm trying to get as many episodes out before I go on holiday for Christmas, much like I did last year. But I think this show is excellent. Such good quality, and with it being season 3, I am just hopeful for a season 4 and can only think about what could have come next. Obviously, trying to tie in the films as well with this whole storyline is a really fun exercise. Thinking about people like Mason Verger, who is obviously part of the film Hannibal, as well as where Clarice could have come into this. And not only from the film, but also from the TV show. And like I say, I will be covering Clarice at some point. I think I'm actually going to start covering it next season. So I've changed things around a little bit, and I'm hoping to get that done so I can sort of wrap up the Hannibal fest, I suppose. But anyway, I'm really excited to get back into this world, and I think I'm just going to get on with it instead of rambling. So here we go. This is Hannibal Season 3, Episodes 5 to 9. Episode 5, Contorno. So picking up from where we left off, we know that Will is actually in Lithuania and is on his way back to Italy with a companion in the form of Chio. And it would seem that this woman has been working for a long time at the Lecter estate. It's honestly a little bit of a weird story in the fact that this woman looks so young compared to Hannibal, and yet she claims that she has been on that estate since Hannibal's sister died, and we're pretty sure that Hannibal's sister died when they were both very young. And if you've seen the film Hannibal Rising, you'll know that she died at a very young age, and Hannibal was around about early teens. So the timeline seems a little bit off, because she says that she served under Hannibal for quite some time, so it's a weird thing, but maybe she just aged very gracefully, because she looks in her mid-30s, whereas Hannibal, obviously played by Mads Mikkelsen, is probably late 40s. So the timeline just doesn't add up. However, they are on their way back to Florence to essentially go and take Lecter out. Chio keeps telling Will that she believes that he is going to be the one that kills Hannibal. And on the train ride back, Will starts to have visions of Chio above him, but looking like she's been gored by probably the black stag that has been plaguing Will's ever-waking dreams. And so due to this, Will keeps waking up on this train. It seems to be one of these overnight trains or cross-country trains, and obviously they're travelling through Europe. So there's bunk beds on the train. Chio and Will are sharing a room, but when he finds out she's no longer in that room, he heads out to go and find her. He finds her right at the back of the train, and she tells Will that she knows that they're going towards Florence, because that's where Hannibal is, definitely. And when he asks her to explain, she kisses him, but also manages to get the upper hand on him and throws him off the train. At this point, the train's going, well, it must be going fairly slowly, because Will survives, but knows that he has to walk a good portion of the way from now on. And like I say, it's a bit of a weird scene, coming back from Lithuania towards Italy. Personally, for me, I don't think it should have been there, but, you know, Again, as I always say, I'm never the director, so it doesn't really matter what my opinion is. As for Hannibal, we know what he's doing. He is waiting around in Italy, and he is essentially waiting for Will. He knows Will's been in the country, and he knows where Will's gone. And so he is waiting on Will to come back. So as he speaks to Bedelia, she inquires, if Will is coming back here, he is coming to kill you. But you already know that you're waiting on him. And so it would seem that this time he is ready to, one, kill Will, but also eat him, if needs be. Jack, of course, is also in Florence, and he ends up honouring the memory of his wife by scattering her ashes in a river. Obviously, any other time that he's been in Italy, he would have been with his wife. And when he goes to speak with Pazzi and his wife Allegra, he tells them as much, that it seems strange being in Florence without his wife. But now he knows he has one goal, and that is to catch Hannibal Lecter. Back in the States, Mason Verger and Alana Bloom have started their plans investigating the whereabouts of Hannibal. And Alana knows that he's going to be living in a very similar situation to the one that he was living in while he was in Baltimore. She's gone over to his house and she's found a bunch of just cutlery and plates and all sorts of fine china, all things that she knows that Hannibal would use and will find again and will also buy. So she's giving Mason this picture of what sort of wealth Hannibal wants to be living with. And she also manages to get some information about some receipts. She's found a place in town where certain items have been bought that she knows that Hannibal would frequent, and also certain wines that he would drink. And she's managed to narrow down the possibilities of where Hannibal is. And so now it's just a case of finding someone in the area who is willing to take up the bounty that is on Hannibal's head to bring him home and hand him over to Mason. Pazzi heads over to see Hannibal, and it is essentially that he is trying to make sure this person, Dr. Fell, is actually Hannibal. And he also wants to know about what happened to Hannibal's predecessors, to make sure that he gets the full story from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But Hannibal is obviously denying any involvement in all these things. But since Pazzi has actually dealt with Hannibal before, he knows that since he doesn't have the backing of his own police department, he can actually go after Hannibal himself. And so he ends up calling a lawyer to talk about the bounty on Hannibal's head, put down by Mason. And when he speaks to his lawyer tells him that he would actually need to speak to an attorney on this because this is dodgy ground that he's basically getting into. But at this point, Hannibal already knows what Pazzi's up to, and he knows that he has to deal with him the next time he sees him. Pazzi has a video chat with Mason over in the States, and also Alana is listening in. Mason tells him that he's going to have to jump through a bunch of hoops just to try and convince Mason that Hannibal is there. He wants Hannibal alive, and he wants to give out $3 million to the person that can do this for him. But he also needs proof first that it is Hannibal, and so he asks for a fingerprint to be got of Hannibal. And so Pazzi ends up going back to see Hannibal at his place of work. And while he's there, Pazzi tells him a story about Francesco de Pazzi, or de Pazzi, who is an ancestor of Rinaldo Pazzi. And it ends with him telling him the gruesome tale of how Pazzi actually ended up being killed. And it turns out that that is exactly the same way that Hannibal is going to kill Rinaldo. And so he chloroforms Rinaldo, he ties him to a gurney and tries to get some information from him about who actually hired him. And he finds out that it was Mason Verger. Just after that, he takes a knife, cuts open the sternum of Rinaldo and pushes him out of a window while he is attached to a rope. And so he hangs and his guts spill out into the courtyard. At this point, Jack turns up because he's been looking for Rinaldo most of the night. And once he gets there, it seems that Hannibal is about to run but then realises he can't get away. Jack is already on his tail and he didn't expect it. Generally, in most situations, Hannibal has the upper hand because he knows what's coming or he has anticipated. He's always a few moves ahead. But in this case, it seems like he isn't. It's almost as if he wasn't expecting Jack to be there at all. And so once Jack gets hold of him, he beats the living shit out of him. I mean, it is brutal. it's not like the one before where Hannibal gets the upper hand and manages to slice Jack's throat. This is a beatdown. But eventually, Jack, through his passion, makes a mistake. And so as Hannibal ends up falling out of the same window that he just pushed Ronaldo Pazzi out of, he manages to latch onto the body and shimmy his way down and onto the ground before slinking off into the night. Episode 6, Dolce. So eventually Will arrives back in Florence. I mean, technically he wasn't in Florence before, he was actually in Sicily, in Palermo, but he arrives back in Italy and is now on the hunt for Hannibal. And his first port of call is where Inspector Pazzi has been found. And again, I say found, Jack is there. And obviously he saw everything that went down and almost caught Hannibal in the act. Everyone still keeps believing that this is Dr. Fell who actually has done these crimes. And Jack is not telling them any different. He is letting them believe this because he knows that he has to bring Hannibal in. And it would seem that instead of trying to do the smart thing and use any and all police resources to bring Hannibal in, he wants to do it all by himself. Or at least with the help of Will. When Jack questions whether Will is ready for this, Will still isn't sure. He still has this feeling that he wants to escape and run away with Hannibal. But Jack tells him that he needs to get over that. He needs to stop having Hannibal in his head now because this isn't healthy for him at all. Hannibal, however, goes to see Bedelia and he asks her why she is packed so lightly. Obviously, they are ready to get out of town, or at least Hannibal is. He is now, after his bloody fight with Jack, all washed up and ready to go, just covered in cuts and bruises everywhere. But Bedelia tells him that this is where we part ways. I'm going to stay here and you're going to go wherever you need to go, but I am not coming with you. And so after Hannibal leaves, Bedelia is visited by Chio, and she also wants to know where Hannibal is, but Bedelia just doesn't want to tell her exactly where Hannibal actually is. I think at this point, Bedelia just doesn't care. She wants to believe this fantasy that she's now been living or has been manipulated into living for the last few months. Because we see that she's taking heroin and is getting so high off it that she is starting to believe that she is Dr. Fell's wife, Mrs. Fell, Lydia Fell. And so when Jack and Will turn up, they start trying to talk to her as Bedelia, but she refuses to believe even them when they're telling her, you aren't this person. You are a totally different person. But she's doing all this to avoid actually giving away anything about where Hannibal is or what he's been up to. So she's literally just getting high to make sure that she doesn't spill any beans. Back in the US, Mason finds out about the fact that Pazzi is now dead. And of course, that was his only hope at that particular point. And it's only when Alana starts to suggest that maybe they need to actually look into bribing other inspectors in the police force, that maybe instead of just one, he needs to bribe a whole department to make sure that they can bring Hannibal in. After Will and Jack have spoken to Bedelia, Jack stays with her, waiting for the police to arrive. But Will has already figured out where Hannibal actually is. And so he heads out to a gallery to go and find him. They sit and talk and everything seems cordial between the two of them until they walk out. And we see that Hannibal is in the crosshairs of a marksman. And as the gun is trained on him, it slowly turns to the side and we see actually the person who he's targeting is actually Will. Just as Will is about to take a knife out of his pocket, a shot rings out and Will goes down. And we see that the person actually on the roof is Chio. She's still got Hannibal's back after all this time, and after everything that he's actually done to her. Essentially, she has wasted the last 20 years of her life looking after a prisoner up at his estate, only to end up killing this prisoner eventually. But she's missed out on so much when it comes to her actual life. We see more manipulation tactics from Mason when it comes to his sister Margot, because all she's ever wanted was a child, and he keeps talking about how he could be the one to give her it. The only problem is, due to him, she's ended up having her womb removed, because he wanted to play sadistic, twisted games, and when he found out that she was pregnant with Will's child, he had her operated on and her womb removed, so she can no longer have children. He suggests that it's a shame that she couldn't have children because he thinks that they would make very good children. Now, let's not forget, that's his sister, and he is talking about incest to create a child. Now, we knew he was odd, we knew he was weird, but that is unmistakably weird. Much later on, however, we find out that Margot is actually having a sexual relationship with Alana Bloom. We knew from previous episodes that Margot was gay. However, we didn't know Alana Bloom actually swung both ways. And so once they actually have, they start to talk about Mason and the fact that he has a massive lead over the FBI. But Margot expects that Mason will end up going to jail over this whole affair because Margot knows that Mason is going to kill and potentially eat Hannibal Lecter. And so she asks Alana about how to harvest sperm. Because Mason isn't wrong, he could still provide sperm for her child, but it doesn't mean that she has to get pregnant from it. Once the second inspector turns up and starts speaking to both Bedelia as Mrs. Fell and Jack, he dismisses Jack because he already knows that Jack's been interviewed when it comes to what happened with Inspector Parsi. But he still wants to interrogate Bedelia as Lydia Fell and shows her the evidence that he knows that she isn't Mrs. Fell because he has the paperwork that was filled out in both Dr. Fell's name and Lydia Fell's name to actually come and work in Italy. And so Bedelia lets something slip, that Dr. Fell or Hannibal will actually be in a place where nobody is meant to be. And we find out that straight away when we see that Hannibal is at the apartment of Sogliato. Ever since he killed him, he's had that in his back pocket as a place that he can go and be alone when he needs to be, which is where he is right now. He's taken Will back there and he's trying to remove the bullet. After he does, he gets Will tied up and puts him at the head of a table. Whilst he starts feeding him soup, we see that Jack has already understood where Hannibal is and has therefore gone over to Sogliato's apartment, where he is met in the lift by Chio. They both head up to the same floor, but Chio claims that she got the wrong one and heads back down. Jack heads into Sogliato's apartment, but when he heads over to Will to untie him, Will tells him Hannibal's under the table. Just then, Hannibal pops out, slices Jack's ankle, and if you've ever seen the Hostel films, you know what that will do. It will incapacitate. Jack falls to the floor, and when he wakes up again, he is also in a chair, facing Will. Hannibal has set up a bunch of things to actually cook on, right in front of both Will and Jack. However, they're unsure of what meat is actually going to be served, until Hannibal makes it clear by taking out a bone saw as he starts to saw into Will's head. Just then, the room goes black, and we think that we're seeing this from Will's perspective, until all of a sudden, the back of a truck opens. Will is hanging upside down, and next to him is Hannibal, as they are both greeted by Mason, who tells them, "Welcome to Muskrat Farm." Episode 7, Digestivo. And so we see how Hannibal and Will both ended up in the States, or at least back in the States at Mason's ranch. And it turns out the amount of money that Mason had put up against Hannibal was enough to buy him a small army. He actually gets the local police department to storm the building where Hannibal actually is. While this small police department are there, they take down both Hannibal and Will. Obviously Will at this point is tied up anyway, so it doesn't really matter, and is bleeding from his forehead because Hannibal just tried to cut his skull open. But when it comes to Jack, they tell him that there is no call for him, and therefore he isn't worth saving. And so they decide that they're going to do exactly what Hannibal was going to do. Jack asks if this is going to be the story, that they kill Jack, and Hannibal conveniently got away once again. And the inspector tells him that's exactly what's going to happen. However, just before they carry out his instructions, shots ring out and the officers left behind are killed. And it turns out that Chio has been watching from afar. And now they leave Italy to head back home. And of course, to head over to Mason's farm. But of course, Mason believes that Jack is dead, and so he informs both Will and Hannibal of that fact, and also the fact that it will be blamed on Hannibal. But of course, Mason has certain plans for Hannibal at this point, and there will never be a trace of him left once Mason is finished with him, because Mason is planning to eat every single part of him. I'm not sure if I mentioned in the last episode a guy called Cordell, who is actually Mason's nurse, but also personal chef, and also seems to be some sort of surgeon. He reminds me of a lot of a character in the Batman universe called Professor Pig, who is a little psychotic, but ultimately is a very skilled and clever person. But the intentions of Mason are actually a little bit more twisted than we'd like to think. We know that he wants to eat Hannibal, we know that he wants to kill Hannibal, but he also wants to cut Will's face off and use it as his own new face. And then he wants to eat Hannibal with Will's face. Because while he sat there eating his own face all those months earlier, he actually was sat thinking that Will has a very nice face and he'd like to wear it. This show gets more and more twisted as we go along, and it ain't gonna get any fucking better anytime soon. I still want a series 4, but it gets a bit much. Alana and Margot, however, are actually in cahoots when it comes to their relationship, because it would seem that Alana is actually going to be a surrogate for a child for Margot, and with Mason gone, it would mean that she would get the estate, because it would be an heir to Mason's fortune. And so that would mean the fortune and the estate and everything else that comes with Mason will actually go to Margot and this child. Mason, however, has other plans for Margot and tells her that yes, he may have got rid of her ovaries, but actually on the farm he has a little surprise for her because her surrogate is already there. He's already implanted his sperm and her egg into something, and that thing is living on the farm. But he never lets on what this thing actually is. But since we know the kind of sick person Mason is, we can kind of guess. And especially since this is a pig farm, we can have a damn good guess at where this alleged child is. Alana goes to visit Will just before his surgery, as in him having his face removed. And she tries to explain her decision with the fact that she got into bed with Mason. She wanted to track down Lecter all along and knew that someone like Mason with the money in his backing was a good idea. The only thing she didn't foresee was the fact that Will was going to be caught as well. And now she knows that she's made a mistake. She has to somehow get him away and get him out of this situation that they are now in. And while Margot is visiting Hannibal, who has been essentially strung up, he is claiming to Margot that it will be Mason who betrays her at some point in the future. Even though he claims that there is a baby out there, even though he claims that there is a chance for her to get her hands on the estate, the only way to actually do this is to do it her way. Just then Alana comes in and helps Hannibal escape, because she needs him to go and help Will, who is just literally about to go in for surgery. And so he does. He heads off to help Will. But as she releases him, Lecter tells her that her and Margot need to go and sort out this situation with Mason. Margot needs to be the one that kills Mason, and even if it means fitting him up for the crime, as in making sure that Hannibal goes down for this, they need to make sure that Mason is dead at the end of all of this. Because he will not pull his punches when it comes to Margot, and so she can't when it comes to him. And so just as the surgery on both Mason and Will is happening, we get all the amazing artistic shots of flesh being taken from an actual face, and it's all graphic and really well done. And as Mason wakes up from his surgery, he shouts to Cordell, thinking something is wrong. And then, as Cordell doesn't appear, he picks up a mirror and realises that his face is Cordell's, and he knows that Lecter has escaped. And also, now Will has been taken as well. Margot and Alana end up searching the whole estate and actually find a huge sow laying on a table with monitors all hooked up to it, but unfortunately the baby that is inside, which they can see on the monitor, is actually dead. Margot has Alana cut it out because she can't believe that he would have done something like this, but there it is. And she takes the baby, knowing that she can't obviously do anything for it, but I assume that she will bury it at some point. She goes to visit Mason, and when she does, she confronts him with everything that's happened. He keeps gloating and telling her that she can't kill him because she needs him. She needs his seed, because if she doesn't have another verger, then it doesn't matter. She can't inherit the estate. And it's here that Alana reveals that Hannibal actually helped them when it came to using a cattle prod on Mason's prostate. And therefore, they have basically milked him of his own sperm. So they now have viable samples. And so they are no longer in need of Mason. He tries to shoot Alana, but Margot struggles with him. And throughout the whole series, there has been this electric eel basically just swimming under Mason's bed at all times. And as they shoot through the glass, Mason falls in and the eel attacks him. Hannibal takes Will back to his house. And while he's there, Chio comes to see Hannibal, and she asks him about what happened with his sister Misha. Hannibal tells her the exact truth, that he didn't kill her, but he did eat her. It seems that there is a pact between the two of them and that she will always protect him. She doesn't want to see him die in a cage. Once Will wakes up, he actually has sort of a session with Hannibal, and he tells Hannibal that he's happy to let him go and let him leave, but he never wants to see him again and he never wants to think about him anymore. And so he believes that Hannibal leaves his home and flees. However, later on, when Jack actually turns up with the rest of the FBI to take Hannibal into custody, Will informed him that he's not here. Just then, out of the darkness, a voice calls out to Jack. Hannibal walks forward and surrenders himself. And all this while Chio is looking on through the sight of her rifle. And this time, she doesn't pull the trigger. She allows Hannibal to be arrested. Episode 8, The Great Red Dragon. And so we are into the final stretch of this whole series. And we have a very interesting character that comes in now by the name of Francis Dolarhyde, who in this series is played by Richard Armitage and who was played in the film Red Dragon by Ralph Fiennes. And this guy is a very interesting character who we will get to know in the next couple of episodes. But this man becomes obsessed with a painting called The Great Red Dragon, and so decides that he needs to have this tattooed on his body, on his back to be precise. We see that he keeps himself in good shape, but we also see that he has a thing against mirrors. In the apartment that he is in, he actually has smashed his mirror, and this is potentially due to the fact that he seems to have a disfigurement. He has a cleft palate and cleft lip, and also he seems to have a speech impediment, and so maybe that is the course of action when he sees himself, that he has to smash the mirrors. And so throughout the next few months, years, this man is prominent throughout the country and starts to have headline news written about him, whereas on the other side, Hannibal is waning. There isn't much interest for him anymore due to the fact that he is incarcerated. Once his trial was over, that was pretty much it. And the way that his trial ended was him declaring himself insane. And therefore he has ended up at the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, still run by Dr. Chilton. However, at this hospital, Alana Bloom is also there as an administrator. And 3 years on, it seems that she is now fitting into that role very perfectly. Will, however, has moved on as well and has a new life. He's still at his cabin, he still has his dogs, but now he has a wife, Molly, and her son, Walter, living with them. And it seems that ever since his problems with Hannibal, he hasn't actually gone back to the FBI. When Dr. Chilton starts speaking to Hannibal about everything that's been going on with a man that he calls the Tooth Fairy, which is the alias that Dolarhyde has been given due to things that we'll get into shortly, we see that Dr. Chilton is now working on this new novel, or a new book dedicated to these killings that this man has been doing. And when he speaks to Hannibal about this, Hannibal seems a little bit jealous because it seems that the world has moved on from Hannibal, or Hannibal the Cannibal as he is now known. And so Hannibal now wishes that there was something that he could get his teeth into. Now, the odd thing about this is when we actually see Hannibal's room in this state hospital, he's got full bookshelves and it's decked out very nicely, from what we can see anyway. And also he has like a full dining table that he can have meals with people. And at one point we see him actually drinking wine with Alana. So even though he is in a mental institution for the criminally insane, it doesn't seem like he's having much of a punishment. I suppose that's why he pleaded for his insanity. Once Chilton leaves, we see that both Hannibal and Dollarhide have very similar ways about them. We see Hannibal not cutting out, but making cutouts or tearing up pages of the newspaper to actually have what looks like a scrapbook of this serial killer, the Tooth Fairy. Whereas Dollarhide has a very similar thing. He is cutting out articles about his own killings, but when he's sticking them in his own scrapbook next to pictures of Hannibal, he actually scrubs out the name, the Tooth Fairy, which is something that Hannibal has already stated, that whoever this is, this killer wouldn't like that name. So we can see that already Hannibal is still sharp as a tack when it comes to these kind of people, whereas Chilton still doesn't know what he's doing, even though he is the so-called expert. But obviously with this new killer on the loose, Jack is bound to go to one person, and of course that is Will. So he heads out to see Will and tries to talk to him about this serial killer. Will doesn't want to know because he's got the family now, but Molly asks him, if more people die and you don't go, you're going to wonder what if. So it's better to go and help them solve this than stay here and wonder forever. However, Will had already received a letter from Hannibal stating that basically if Will ends up getting back on the case, it's just going to send him down a path of madness. And he knows that Jack is going to come over and try and speak to Will about this. Will goes against the advice of Hannibal and finds himself at the latest crime scene. We see how violent and vicious this man is. He sneaks into the house of this family. He cuts the carotid artery of the husband, making him bleed out, while he shoots the wife in the stomach as she tries to escape. He then walks through to the bedroom and kills both the children, before coming back and ends up posing the bodies, while smashing all the mirrors in the house and placing bits of the mirror onto each one of the children and the parents around what seems to be any opening on the person, including the eyes and mouth. And so we see how just twisted this guy is when it comes to these killings. Will, however, finds talcum powder at the scene and knows that there isn't any in the house, so how did it get there? And he realises that whoever this man was, he took the gloves off and he touched the face of the mother of the family. So Will gets the investigation team to actually find out if she has any fingerprints on her. And they find, oddly enough, one on her eye, which they managed to lift. And it's genuinely a weird scene to watch. I cringed throughout the whole thing because I just felt weird about it. I still feel weird about it now. Will also found something in the fridge which was of interest. And it was a baby bell with a bite mark in it. And these seem to match the bite marks that are actually on the victims. And so we can see that whoever this guy is, he's biting them, and he has a very strange set of teeth. Earlier on in the episode, however, we actually saw Francis Dollarhide not only getting this tattoo on his back, but also buying a fake set of teeth from what seems to be some sort of backstreet dentist. And so it would seem that Francis, any time that he goes out, he takes these teeth with him and bites his victims for his own pleasure, but also it will throw off any investigation that is against him because, in fairness, he has pretty decent teeth. And hence, that is why he is called the Tooth Fairy. And so, because Will needs more information on this guy, he cannot deduce who this guy is just from this one crime scene. And he goes to the person he knows who has been studying this throughout, and he asks Jack if he can go to see Hannibal. So for the first time in 3 years, Hannibal and Will are back in the same room. Episode 9, and the woman clothed with the sun. So we pick up right where we left off, and that is Will visiting Hannibal. But of course, we know from previous episodes, and especially when Hannibal was arrested, that Will no longer wants anything to do with him whatsoever. And so this, after 3 years, is difficult for Will to be doing. But this for Will is all about this Tooth Fairy killer. This guy is actually killing families. And since Will is now a family man, it is the perfect case for him to actually be on, because it will drive his focus. And that's what Jack knows. And so even though he doesn't want to speak to Hannibal, he knows that having Hannibal as his right-hand man, I suppose, is going to be helpful towards his final goal of catching this guy. And so he just has to suck it up. Throughout the episode, we keep seeing how manipulative Hannibal actually is. And we see further back in the past. And it comes to a day when he's actually with Abigail Hobbs. And on the day that Abigail was declared as dead, basically, we see how he actually uses her. Abigail by no means at this point is a young woman anymore. She may have a young woman's body, but she has seen some shit. And so to have Hannibal basically playing around in her head so much, it's very odd to see her in this situation where essentially Hannibal draws her blood because they are going to use it as if someone slit her throat. And so with this blood that he takes from her, they essentially, in cahoots with each other, spray it around Abigail's old home to make it look like part of a crime scene. So when Abigail goes missing and eventually they find her ear in Will's throat, it all starts to make sense. It's at this point also that he asks Abigail if he can take a piece of her. And she asks him if he wants a finger, and he brushes her hair behind her ear and tells her no. And obviously we know what piece he takes, so it's a very poignant scene. Eventually we see now that Abigail is actually in hiding. Hannibal has her father dug out of the ground and essentially props him up in his study and stands with Abigail while he has a teaching moment with her. Essentially he tells her that the reason that her father slit her throat was because it was an act of love, an act of mercy, because he knew what was coming when it came to the FBI and Will and the press and everything around it. And so by killing her, it would save her from what he actually was. But of course, she ended up being saved by Will and then found out the horrors of her actual father's life. And so if the situation was reversed and it was Abigail in that hot seat, she'd have done the same. She'd have shown her love to her father, and at which point she gets up and heads over to her father and slits his throat, which impresses Hannibal. And of course, again, just shows how deep this man has his claws into people once he actually does this voodoo that he's got. He's had it in Jack, Alana, Abigail, Will, Bedelia, and many others throughout the show. And of course it all comes to a head when it shows one of the final clips of season 2. We see the night that Hannibal killed Abigail and almost killed both Will and Jack. And Alana also ended up nearly dead. So when Will calls Hannibal to let him know that the FBI is on its way, it's at this point that Hannibal tells Abigail what is going to be happening and that she must stay, but also he's going to teach her to hunt, just like she did with her father. And of course that night she ends up hunting Alana and throwing her out the window. So we see how just abhorrent this guy is, and he will do anything to get what he wants. When Hannibal starts to look into these cases of the Tooth Fairy, and obviously sees these families, he begins to think about how these murders have actually been done. And he tells Will that he believes each murder would have actually been done in a remote area. So he isn't sure at the time because none of the photos actually show this, but he asks Will if these places are remote, because if they are, it would make sense. It seems that there is a killing every new moon of the lunar cycle, so Hannibal believes that this man would kill in the nude and then go out into the moonlight to cleanse himself. And that's why it would make more sense for him to be out in the sticks somewhere, because he wouldn't be disturbing the neighbours. And in the storyline terms, it actually makes kind of some sense, because when you think about what Dolarhyde is trying to perceive himself as. He perceives himself as this terrifying dragon, this red dragon. And much later on, we actually see him having a hallucination of him actually having the dragon's tail. And so he believes that he is morphing into this. And if that means being outside naked after killing someone, covered in blood, under a new moon, it could be feasible that this is what he's imagining for himself. When Will heads out to one of the other sites where the Tooth Fairy has committed murders, he ends up finding a symbol carved into a tree and knows that that is where this man has been looking on from. It also seems that any alert system, for instance, a dog or a cat, that could potentially alert these people to what's going to happen, he deals with fairly early on. So in one case, a cat has been killed, and in another, a dog was injured to the point where it ended up in the vets. So on the night that Dolarhyde turned up to kill, there would be no animal interaction or interference, and therefore he could just get away with the murders because he seems to be murdering people in the night. So after he finds this symbol, the symbol of the red dragon, he finds Freddie Lowndes. And of course, she is trying to get the scoop on all of this. He tells her that he's not happy with her because she took pictures of him while he was in bed. After everything that went down before, he was actually bedbound for a while with a colostomy bag. And Freddie thought it would be a good idea to take photos of him. And, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the actual news, but that kind of thing sickens me. For instance, I know TMZ recently got involved with Liam Payne, and that sickens me that this is what the world's come to. But here it is. Like 9 years ago, they were still doing the same thing, just showing it on TV shows as this sort of shock value. And now it seems to be mainstream, and it's fucking rough. Freddie tells Will that she knows that he went to meet Hannibal, and so she publishes an article about all of it, which Francis Dolarhyde ends up reading the article. And so now he has Will's face and Hannibal's face, and so he knows the people that are going to be coming after him. Because essentially Freddie has said that Will is investigating these Tooth Fairy murders. We do see, however, that Dolarhyde has a softer side when he actually meets a woman named Reba McLean. And this woman is a developer at a film lab. But the interesting thing about Reba is she's actually blind. And so when she actually speaks to Dolarhyde, she doesn't judge him on his appearance. And she listens to everything that he says. And obviously she picks up that he has a speech impediment, but she doesn't judge him for it. She tells him that he speaks very well. And it seems that this person is going to be the one that could potentially turn him around, because she's the type of person that he needs in his life, a positive influence. And he seems to like her as well. But as with many others, he just wants to keep his distance because of everything that he's been through in the past. Will starts to have more and more nightmares about the whole situation with Dolarhyde. And the last time that he had something like this was obviously when he was investigating Hannibal. And it's such a terrible situation for Will, throwing himself back into basically the lion's den, because just like last time, there's no one to help pull him out. I suppose Molly is there, but he had a romantic interest before in Alana, and it didn't help one little bit. So when Jack goes to see Hannibal, Hannibal tells him as much, that it wasn't a smart idea bringing Will in on this. Will isn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared last time. And he thinks it's a really dumb idea for Jack to actually be trusting Will right now. Or at all. Because he's just throwing him to the wolves. And so when Jack leaves, Hannibal actually gets a phone call. A nurse comes in and hands him a phone, telling him it's his attorney. However, the voice at the end of the line starts with a stutter. And we realise instantly that it is Francis Dolarhyde. He tells Hannibal that he feels delighted that Hannibal actually took an interest in him and knows that he will be more interested in what he's actually becoming. And so Hannibal inquires, what are you becoming? And Dolarhyde says, the Great Red Dragon. Now, these last 5 episodes have been very, very impressive. Hard work at times, because obviously the switch from Italy over to America with the 3-year gap, and with Mason and Margot Verger in the middle, it just sort of combined 3 films all together. I know technically that it was 2 films because it has elements of Hannibal and Red Dragon in this, but also going back to the whole situation in Lithuania, it sort of brings in Hannibal Rising as well. But I just feel like the whole thing with Italy, the whole story of the book Hannibal and this, that and the other could have been extended a little bit more, and they could have had the season 4. And I'm going to get into what I think in the next episode and where this should have gone and where it should have ended. But I think this sort of staggered season it confused me a little bit, it confused it a little bit. And obviously some of the time frames, I mean, they're going across Europe to get back to Florence, and it just feels like it's instant. Will gets thrown off a train and he has to walk into Italy. It's ridiculous. And so it's sometimes things like that where they could have actually extended this storyline out to show how Will got up to Lithuania but also got back to Lithuania, had a bit more involvement in and around Italy before eventually moving back to America to take up the Francis Dolarhyde thing. Maybe have shown the end of the season with Mason Verger and the arrest, but then have it end there to then go on to the next season and have this full season as sort of Red Dragon. So have season 4 as sort of a Red Dragon. But again, I'm not a director, I'm not a producer, I'm not the fucking backing company, so I don't have any say. But that's how I'd have done it. And now, HBO, I think this is by, are looking for content. And like most companies, they're all looking for content. Fuck's sake, if they can get another season of Dexter, they surely need to bring this back to the forefront. But again, I will keep pulling for it until it actually happens, very much like I keep pulling for that National Treasure 3 film. So, look, I'm done for today, and I've really enjoyed watching these episodes. They are crazy, but it's what I love about Hannibal. It is such an interesting story, he's such an interesting character, and to go through these episodes again, it really is some of the best TV. So I hope if you haven't watched it, you go and watch it. If you have watched it, go and watch it again. And just enjoy it. Just enjoy it for what it is. I mean, I sit and watch this with headphones on now, and it's such a different experience as well. You take in quite a lot more. So if you get a chance to, watch it with headphones in. So it's a very different experience. But anyway, I am done. So as always, I hope you're doing well out there. Please come over to Patreon and help me out over there. That'd be great. We've really got going over there now, so there's quite a lot of content up there. Well, there's 3 seasons of Game of Thrones, that's your thing, but I'd break it down with individual episodes, so it's a different format to this. But for now, thank you for listening, and until next time, I will speak to you soon. Bye. And that is it for now, amigos. And yes, I am as angry as you are at me for that sentence, but I hope you enjoyed the show and had some fun along the way. It means a lot that you are listening and supporting me. This is an independent podcast after all, and doesn't get a lot of backing, so it's great to know that you're out there, you're listening. And if you want to come talk to me on any of the platforms I'm on, just come say hi. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and I'm even a little bit on TikTok. I don't post that much, but I'm on there. And you can also drop comments in the comment sections on any of the platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, wherever you get podcasts from. But as always, thank you for your time, and I will speak to you soon.